Good morning. My name is Alicia Yates, and today I'm going to be speaking with you all about the significance of the forest in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. To begin, I cannot think of another American novel that is as rich in symbolism as Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. If we were to try to ascribe one theme to this novel, it would be very difficult because this is a very intricate novel that is just full of depth and is full of really many themes that we could discuss. But I think that we could all agree that one of the prevailing themes is the consequences of sin. Throughout the novel, Nathaniel Hawthorne uses a lot of imagery, many metaphors, and many symbols to showcase the significance or the consequences of sin. Today we're going to talk about one of those symbols, and that is the forest. So let's go ahead and jump right into what is the significance, what is the symbolic significance of the forest in this novel. To begin, let's talk about what the forest is. The forest is a symbol of the moral wilderness. On page 137 of the book, there is this quotation about Hester. It says, "She wandered without rule or guidance in a moral wilderness as vast and as intricate and shadowy as the untamed forest." Hester Prynne, we know that she was guilty of the sin of adultery. When she is found guilty of the sin, she does not have sympathy from her community. Okay, really, just as we read this from a modern sense, hopefully we as Christians recognize that Hester is the kind of person that needs the care for the church more than anybody else. She has a fatherless child. James tells us that pure religion is to visit the fatherless and widow in their affliction. Pearl is a fatherless child, and yet the church does not seem to have the compassion for her that they biblically should have. So naturally, Hester is just left to her own devices. Later on that same page, it lets us know that shame, despair, and solitude would end up being her teachers. Okay, so when a person is in a place like Hester is, where they have no one really to help them through the toughest trials that they go through, or really no one to really help them to know what to do with the broken pieces of their lives, they're just kind of left to their own devices. And we know from Judges that when every man does that which is right in his own eyes, he makes a lot of mistakes. And so that is the case with Hester. So she essentially, because she's got nobody to guide her, she wanders around in her mind through this moral wilderness. That moral wilderness of her mind is really, Nathaniel Hawthorne presents an image of that moral wilderness through the forest. The forest is the place of temptation, which we'll get to in just a moment. But it is the place where basically people wander around without law or rule. On page 139, just a couple pages later, it says that wild heathen nature of the forest, never subjugated by human law, nor illumined by higher truth. I am reminded from this part of the story that when people do not have the word of God as a foundation for themselves, they do essentially wander around through this forest of life, basically with shame, despair, and solitude as their own teachers. And they make very poor decisions as a result of that. So as I alluded to this just a little bit earlier, but this is the place of temptation. One of the most interesting things that Nathaniel Hawthorne does is he juxtaposes the forest with the marketplace. Okay, so the marketplace represents the place of public life. Now, the marketplace is the domain of the Puritans. Essentially, the way that Nathaniel Hawthorne writes this novel, he describes this area as a place where it takes place in Boston, but he basically describes the Puritans coming here and trying to establish kind of a Puritan utopia. The forest, on the other hand, is, like we said, it is the moral wilderness, and these two places are right next to each other. When Chillingworth enters into the story, he enters from the forest and he comes into the marketplace. On page 51, we really see this contrast. I've got this quotation up here on the screen, but this is Chillingworth speaking to Hester. Now, Chillingworth, we know, is the husband of Hester Prynne. They had been married over in England, but he said this to her: "I might have known that as I came out of the vast and dismal forest and entered into this settlement of Christian men, the very first object to meet my eyes would be thyself, Hester Prynne." If you will go over in your books to page 54, I'd like to read a little bit of this together. We'll really see that juxtaposition between the forest, the moral wilderness, and then the marketplace, the place of the Puritans. So on page 54, if you will go to the last paragraph on 54, the question that kind of comes up is, why doesn't Hester just why doesn't she just leave this town where she is just in so much shame? And we get some answers to that, but then we also get a picture of this juxtaposition. It may seem marvelous that with the worlds before her, kept by no restrictive clause of her condemnation within the limits of the Puritan settlement, so remote and so obscure, free to return to her birthplace or to any other European land, and there hide her character and identity under a new exterior, as completely as if emerging into another state of being. And this is where I really want to focus. And having also the passes of the dark, inscrutable forest open to her, where the wildness of her nature might assimilate itself with a people whose customs in life were alien from the law that should had condemned her. It may seem marvelous that this woman should still call this place her home. So here she is, continuing to choose to live in this Puritan utopia, even though the people shame her, the people despise her for her sins. When right next to this place, you have this forest where she could be accepted. She wouldn't have to deal with the shame that she has to deal with, particularly in the marketplace. So Nathaniel Hawthorne just very skillfully puts these two places right next to each other. The marketplace that is just full of judgment, the picture of the public life, with the forest, which is symbolic of the moral wilderness. Let's begin by talking about a very important character who lives in the forest, and that is the black man. Okay, now the black man, we don't ever actually see the black man. We don't see lines from the black man throughout this story. The black man, as a reader, I find myself wondering, like, is the black man supposed to be like a literal character, or is he supposed to be kind of a tall tale, kind of a legend? In Miss Martinez, in your videos a couple weeks ago, she was talking about the Florida man. I didn't know about the Florida man until like 2 weeks ago, and I live in Florida, so I was kind of intrigued by that whole story. But we hear about people like Bigfoot. In some ways, the black man kind of sounds like that type of character, not as silly, much more serious than that. But the black man symbolizes basically evil, darkness, and temptation. The first time that he is mentioned is on page 53. So when Chillingworth approaches Hester, they have a very private conversation where we see Hester just able to be totally honest. She will not tell anybody who the father is of her child, and then she also will not tell anyone that she hasn't told anyone up to this point that Chillingworth is her husband. So here we see Hester able to have just a very honest conversation with Chillingworth. And Chillingworth is just brutal to her. We're not going to read this whole conversation, but he has a lot of bitterness in his heart. You'll see that develop throughout the entire novel. And he's very manipulative, very just downright evil in the way that he speaks to Hester. And then Hester makes this statement. This is the first time that the black man is mentioned in this novel. On page 53, Hester says, "Art thou like the black man that haunts the forest round about us? Hast thou enticed me into a bond that will provide the ruin of my soul?" So we see that Hester introduces the black man to us by comparing Chillingworth to him. The black man is the person that haunts the forest, the person who entices us into bonds that are going to ruin our soul. And really what we see here is a personification of what temptation does to us. It lures us in, it entices us, and then ultimately it brings about our own destruction. The black man also has a book for people to sign. And if you will turn in your books to page 135, I'd like to read a passage where we just kind of see exactly, we read a little bit more about this book that the black man has. On page 135, and that's the wrong place, I'm sorry, page 80. Sorry, I was looking ahead a little bit. Let's go to page 80 in our books. Page 80. An earlier instance in the book, in the Scarlet Letter, when we find out about the black man's book. Hester Prynne has just had a meeting with Governor Bellingham, Arthur Dimmesdale, Reverend John Wilson, and they're having a discussion about removing Pearl from Hester. And ultimately, Dimmesdale ends up speaking on Hester's behalf. The other men don't know why, but Hester is able to keep Pearl. As Hester is leaving Governor Bellingham's mansion on page 80, Hester has a conversation with Governor Bellingham's sister, Mistress Hibbins. Mistress Hibbins is a witch who inhabits the forest, and we often see Mistress Hibbins basically going out and trying to entice people to come into the forest. So on page 80, if you will go to the third full paragraph, it begins with hist, hist. Hist, hist, said she. Well, this is Mistress Hibbins, while her ill-omened physiognomy seemed to cast a shadow over the cheerful newness of the house. Wilt thou go with us tonight? There will be a merry company in the forest, and I well nigh promise the black man that comely Hester Prynne should make one. Make my excuse to him, so please you, answered Hester with a triumphant smile. I must tarry at home and keep watch over my little Pearl. Had they taken her from me, I would willingly have gone with thee into the forest and signed my name in the black man's book too, and that with mine own blood. What Mistress Hibbins is, what this scene kind of reminds me of is, it makes me, if we were to put this in like kind of a modern day scenario, I think of Mistress Hibbins to me like feels like kind of a shady person that you might see on the street who's like, hey, come over here. Maybe she's offering drugs. Who knows what she's enticing people with? But hey, come to the party. Hey, we're gonna have a lot of fun. Hey, if you just join us, everybody else is doing it. We are going to have a great time. That's kind of what Mistress Hibbins makes me think of. And Hester, at this point, she acknowledges that because of her responsibility toward Pearl, because she has to take care of her, she does not want to do this. And so we really see Pearl, in a sense, kind of saving Hester from making further mistakes, which I think is just a very sweet part of this story. The fact that he has this book, to me, this really denotes the permanence at times that our mistakes can have. Now, this is not in any way to undermine grace, okay? One of the most amazing things about the grace of God is that he takes our brokenness, he makes beauty for ashes, and he can, in spite of the mistakes that we do make, the Lord can still do amazing things in spite of that because he is God. Nevertheless, okay, as human beings, we must understand that our sin is going to have consequences. And in many cases, those consequences are going to be permanent consequences. And I think the fact that the people would actually sign their name in the black man's book, it kind of denotes the more permanent significance of the decisions that we make. Let's talk now about the significance of the forest in just developing the story. One thing that is just very sad to me about the forest, in my opinion, I think that the forest is the place that we see Hester just the most candid. At first I said honest. Now that's not totally true. There's a part in the story where she actually lies to Pearl about the Scarlet Letter, and she has a conversation with Dimmesdale. And Dimmesdale is, for the first time, just completely candid, raw, authentic about his feelings. And we see Hester like that as well. From a human standpoint, authenticity is something that we naturally crave. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we talk about the applications. But part of what I personally find sad about this is I'm just reminded about the fact that as I see this very authentic conversation that Hester has with Dimmesdale in the forest, I'm just reminded that in the marketplace, there weren't people that were just there for her. And so what she chose to do was we see these authentic conversations in the forest, in the place of temptation, okay? Now, Hester is still responsible for her own choices, but just as a Christian leader, I am just reminded from this of just my role in making sure if people are truly struggling with things, be a person that they are able to talk to about, so that shame, despair, and solitude won't be their teachers, but rather we can dig into God's word together and we can talk about the Bible answers for their greatest problems. And then the forest, I have a cat, she's playing behind the camera. The forest also ends up becoming a place of fantasy and really a place to escape reality. I'd like to turn to page 135 in this book, and I'd like to read a scheme that Hester and Dimmesdale end up coming up with. So on page 135, I am starting at, there's two long paragraphs at the bottom of the page. I'm starting at the second to last long paragraph. It begins with, then there is the broad pathway. Then there is the broad pathway of the sea, continued Hester. It brought thee hither. If this is Hester speaking to Dimmesdale. If thou so choose, it will bring thee back again. In our native land, whether in some remote rural village or in vast London, or surely in Germany, in France, in pleasant Italy, thou wouldest be beyond his power and knowledge. It's beyond Chillingworth's power and knowledge. So she's telling him, hey, we can escape Chillingworth, because Chillingworth had been a leech. He had been tormenting Dimmesdale. And what hast thou to do with all these iron men and their opinions? They have kept thy better part in bondage too long already. The minister, I'm going to skip a little bit. The minister at first just objects to her notion. Let's just leave here. Let's just get on a ship. Let's just go to Europe. Let's just start a new life. And at first he's like, no, that's crazy. But as she's telling him these things, she's very compelling. And then if you will go to the very end of the chapter on page 136, if you look at the last two lines, it says this, thou shalt not go alone. Okay, he's like, he says something about going alone. And she says, thou shalt not go alone. Answered she in a deeper whisper. Then all was spoken. So Dimmesdale and Hester in the forest make the decision that they, instead of Dimmesdale facing the people and owning up to his own sin, owning up to his double life that he had been living, they make the decision that they are going to get on a boat, they're going to go to Europe, maybe go under a different name, and they're just going to start a new life, and they're going to live happily ever after. Now, there's a lot of problems with this, and so let's talk about just some of the truths to be learned from this whole scenario. Okay, so first of all, we really learn from this that the forest is a place of fantasy, but the forest is not reality. Whenever I teach this to my students, I always point out Hester schemes in the forest, but she does not live in the forest. Let me say that again. Hester schemes in the forest, but she does not live in the forest. I know just a few moments ago we talked about how she lived in the marketplace out of her own accord, but I am just reminded so often in our lives when people make poor decisions, they make these poor decisions in the forest, but then they end up having to face reality, okay? Why do people choose to throw away their marriages? Why do people choose to get involved with drugs? Why do people make really harmful decisions that they know will have long-lasting effects? Well, in the moment, they allow the forest to become their reality, but eventually they do have to face the music, and they do have to actually step back into the real world and face their consequences. We also learn that Hester's imaginations did not come true the way that she had hoped. I'm reminded of the verse, I'm reminded of the verse that says, be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. Dimmesdale was going to reap the consequences for his duplicity. And Hester may have thought they could escape it, but they absolutely could not. I'm also reminded from this, we need to be true in the marketplace, not just in the forest. Toward the end of the novel, Nathaniel Hawthorne, as he's giving his final commendations, he says this, be true, be true, be true. And I think that that is just really one of the most important truths of this novel. May this be a reminder to us that the forest for us is this world, and it is not our true home. Though we may be residing here at the moment, we are pilgrims on our way to a better country, as Hebrews 11:25 tells us. May we, like Moses, choose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season.